4. Gunhild now has come on for Action Track 2. Martina, Action Track 3. I think it's just Action Track 5 outstanding.
Okay.
Unless, please shout if I've missed anyone.
Yeah, well, it's only just 1/2 the hour, so I'm sure we're doing very well actually here with people coming in on time. Okay.
So, Sandy, should I kick this off? It is 4:30.
Yeah, I think
we'll be joining halfway through, and I would, they may bitterly regret they haven't heard my important opening remarks, which are going to be the high point of the afternoon. But I guess they'll have to just live with that. Look, hello everybody. Those of you, a number of you know me, a number of you don't. I'm John Beddington. I was co-chairing the global panel with John Kafur, who has actually now stepped down. And so I'm basically not co-chairing it, I'm chairing the global panel at the moment. And I'd like on behalf of the global panel to welcome you all. I think that everybody understands who is here, the real difficulties there are out there. And I think that this sort of thing that we're moving towards is something that has a real cause for hope. I was absolutely delighted to see the action track plans and the people who are actually involved in it. It is very impressive. I think it struck me as that this is the sort of way that the run up to these big meetings should be done. And I think I was very, very taken with it. We had some conversation within the global panel, and I think the idea there was that we really would want and would like to offer our help to these various action tracks. Not help that we hope you will say, oh my God, we don't want them helping us. I genuinely hope that we will actually be able to help you. And I think the point that would be worth making is that we're going to give you some presentation from Tim and Patrick this afternoon. We will move to a sort of Q&A session, which we really want to hear your thoughts and concerns from us. I'm not going to try to even formally chair this. I think Tim and Patrick will be able to do that as questions arise. But I think the offer that I'd be putting out there is that we do have a secretariat who are geared up to help as and when requests come in from the various action teams. I'm particularly pleased that we've got Agnes Kalabata, who is one of our panel members, is so centrally involved in this process, which is great. And so that's enough from me. Everybody has to, everybody knows there's a welcome, got to be done. The welcome is now finished, and I promise you will not hear from me again this afternoon. And that is a genuine promise. So thank you all very much for turning up. We're now moving, we're no longer in English summertime. I'm looking out of the window, it is completely dark, and the only light on the table is some things that we've heard from the USA and that Pfizer may have a vaccine. So that's light outside my window. And over to you now, Tim, Patrick, to make your presentation. So thank you all very much. Look forward to meeting you face to face, assuming this bloody vaccine works. And let's hope it does. So over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, John. Yeah, you can see there's plenty of light outside my windows, and that's a reflection of what's been going on here, I think, I hope, anyway. So I'm going to give you a very quick, hopefully, overview of the Foresight report. As John said, this is not to convince you of anything new. This is the findings, the thinking, the evidence brought together for this report are very, very much in line with the 5 action track issues and agendas. Essentially, we want to show you some of the newer things that we've been doing and figure out how can the panel and the Secretariat, led by Sandy Thomas here, facilitate, engage with you in this so important agenda. So the panel itself is made up of this high-level membership, recently including the DG of FAO and Schengen Fang, formerly of IFPRI, high-level people operating in their personal capacity with a secretariat in London ably led by Sandy, as I said, and its role, its function has essentially been focused on both global issues, but essentially the main audience is low and middle income country policymakers, trying to distill the most useful and relevant and recent evidence to help them shape their thinking to bring policies and investments to bear, not just from government, but in partnership with private sector and civil society, to reshape food systems to enhance the quality of diets, diets for all, diets being as a central issue. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I mean, it's clear that the more foresight messages are very much in line with what's been going on. We all face astonishing crises, and the poor quality of diets for many people lies at the core. It's the linchpin between health problems, human health problems, and planetary health problems. And we need to bring more attention, understanding, and investments to bear on how do we get everyone to access and afford high quality diets. We're very much focused on the urgency of the agenda, especially since COVID may well have made things a lot worse than they already were. But we are very much in this report focused on the feasibility of this agenda. Not simply saying everyone's got something to do. It's actually a very daunting set of actions that need to be undertaken. There are a lot of trade-offs to be addressed. And so this report focuses very much not just on making the case for transformation, but on the steps needed during a transition phase to actually begin to head us in the right direction, right? So when I use transition, I'm saying let's almost take the transformation for granted. What that will be, we don't know yet, but let's enable countries to think about the transition steps that could begin today. So premises underlying this report is that diets are a core driver. We need to understand them much better, and we need to find out how can we influence choices made, not just by consumers, but the choices made by businesses, the choices made by governments themselves. The things that shape diets at all points across the food systems. There's a lot of incentives and disincentives that have to be addressed in various ways. And we focus in this report on the realities. What are the transitions? So we look at things like the potential for repurposing agriculture, research and development priorities, or ag sector subsidies. Very much look at how to make food-based dietary guidelines not just more useful to the consumer, but policy facing. What can we know about the future affordability of diets, and how can we discuss trade-offs, political as well as economic trade-offs, more coherently, and not shy away from, but actually address the potential policy barriers and highlight the entry points, the multi-win entry points that we need to convince all the stakeholders. So don't worry, I'm not doing a long focus on the underlying drivers. We all know here that dietary factors are a major burden for human health, and they are growing, and diet-related chronic diseases as well as undernutrition are all escalating. But I think it's really important to say that it's low and middle income countries are significantly affected by these factors, and the threats are growing. Right? It's not just undernutrition in part of the world, overnutrition in the rest. This is a global challenge. And at the same time, the food systems are damaging the planet, not just climate change, but biodiversity, loss of resources, water pollution, air pollution, and so on. And so we have to bring these two elements, the food systems contributions to human health and planetary health, together to generate solutions. This report came down, and I highlight Lawrence's role as a key member of the lead expert group here, in 4 quadrants. Achieving sustainable healthy diets can't be made if we haven't made the right foods available, right? So that requires us to rethink a lot of ag sector subsidies, for example, and R&D, and focus on the production side. It can't be ignored, but it's not just that. We have to ensure those foods are accessible, not just the foods, but the foods that make up a diet. And there's a lot of elements here that the private sector dominates in transformation, marketing, storage, and innovation. A lot of things can be done, for example, in cutting loss and waste. But those foods also, those diets have to be affordable. There's a huge element here that is coming right up to the front about the lack of affordability, not just the 3 billion people currently unable to afford a healthy diet. When you make it a sustainable, healthy diet, affordability becomes a key issue. And this isn't just about reducing the price of foods or shifting the relative price of foods between nutrient rich and nutrient poor. It's about increasing the purchasing power and reducing poverty as well, right? So it's enabling people to purchase what they need to purchase. And for them to do that, that mix of foods that makes up a healthy, sustainable diet has to be desirable, right? And there are many ways. Obviously, the private sector has a key role here with the public sector. Food-based dietary guidelines have to be dramatically improved around the world. No one is suggesting they are perfect. They are not perfect. But there are a lot of behavioral nudges, a lot of taxes and subsidies that could be considered. Now, these four, we ended up with four. They actually align very nicely with, in fact, your 5 action tracks, because resilience and the importance of making food systems more resilient is embedded throughout. We may differ on the priorities or the choices of examples, but much of this is framed by evidence, and we have articulated it in a way that we hope will resonate with policymakers and others throughout the system. So I'm just going to go through those 4 elements, the 4 quadrants that I give you examples of what we've been looking at. One is, all these examples are based on our own new modeling that was commissioned for this report. Now, one area that's been talked about by the World Bank and the EU recently is the repurposing of ag sector subsidies, which may make sense or may not make sense. But when you look at the countries that have subsidies, and not all countries do, but the scale of the subsidies can affect a lot of what's going on. Now, here, if we looked at removing 100% of subsidies, completely removing all subsidies, and what this had, the effect this had through dynamic modeling, was actually a reduced vegetable consumption in certain parts of the areas of the world, Europe particularly, but also China, and a little bit of increase in low and middle income countries. If you repurposed at least a portion of those subsidies to support vegetable production, and you made those subsidy levels proportionate with the population of the countries in which those subsidies were allocated, what you see is a significant increase in vegetable consumption in low and middle income countries, right? So it's not simply remove it or reallocate it. There's a lot of things going on. And it's not, you can't just look at vegetables, you have to look at what happens then to staples, what happens to fruits or legumes and so on. But these are important insights that we need to share with policymakers and donors to think through what could be the dynamic effects of changes. That's just for consumption. Same thing has to be done for the effects on the environment. And I'm not going to explain all of these, just that in terms of greenhouse gases, the place on the left here, this is complete removal of subsidies, actually does have a significant reduction in greenhouse gases, particularly in OECD and non-OECD countries. But the blue are countries currently without subsidies. They're mainly low-income countries. And you do see an increase in those settings in terms of greenhouse gases. The same happens for nitrogen use, for example. Remove subsidies as they currently stand. There's a significant drop in nitrogen usage. However, there's an increase in other parts of the world where currently subsidies are not used. Essentially, other countries taking advantage of the advantage that rich countries currently have with their subsidies, right? So these things matter. There are trade-offs everywhere, both in the economics, in the health, and in the planetary effects. The second quadrant, accessibility. Obviously, food loss and waste have become major issues. We did some scenarios around, well, what happens to the nutrients available, not just the foods, but the nutrients available. We looked at a rise in food loss and waste from current levels by about a third by 2030. And essentially, what we see is a lot of loss of calories and protein, as well as significant amounts of key vitamins through the foods that would be most likely to be lost based on current patterns. Across all foods, 50% of all the losses is essentially associated with perishables, which you'd expect, and those are the nutrient-rich foods we want more of in the diet, not less. The other scenario, meet the SDGs targets, cut loss and waste by 50%. And what you see is what you might expect. The supply, of course, it has to be consumed, but the supply of iron increases, folate deficiencies drop fourfold. In low and middle income countries, you see riboflavin deficiencies disappear. The supply of calories increases to the level where, if equitably distributed, would remove hunger. And important nutrients like polyunsaturated fatty acids and fruit and vegetable consumption, all increasing not just through, but as a result of and associated with loss of food loss and waste. Now, this requires incentives, economic parameters to facilitate this. It requires innovations in storage, new technology to be applied, more efficiency in both long and short chain marketing systems. It's not going to happen overnight. The affordability question. So 3 billion, FAO just reporting 3 billion people unable to afford healthy foods today. We looked at, well, if you project out shifts in a range of diets, not just flexitarian, but from business as usual all the way through to vegan, right? A whole range of different diets. And you project out shifts in demand and the relative prices that might be associated with that. And we were actually quite surprised to see that projected changes in flexitarian diets, ones that allow some meat, some dairy, as well as nutrient-rich foods and so on. Yeah, there may well be increases, but not ones that take them out of affordability, out of reach. And even though Ethiopia stands out there a bit, and so there are some places where the cost would increase, if we manage to increase income along with these costs, then affordability can be managed. It's not a given, but it's also not a universal constraint. The final one, desirability. Again, I'm not proclaiming that food-based dietary guidelines work. We know they don't work, but they don't work for many reasons. They're not digestible to consumers. They're certainly not supporting policymaker understanding of priorities or what are the options. But we did a review of those countries that do have current updated food-based dietary guidelines, and most of them, what they produce and what they consume in those countries doesn't even come close to their own national food-based dietary guidelines. And none of them, zero, not one of them, would allow for achieving the Paris Accords by shifting agricultural systems and food system contributions. Right? So not only are they not meeting health goals, they're not meeting planetary goals either. So work in this space a lot are things that can be put on the table for governments to consider. So we're not shying away from the challenge, the trade-offs. A transformation requires, as we've just said, actions across the whole food system in all 4 quadrants, in all 5 of your action tracks, and we have to map those out coherently so that we understand the synergies, the value added from doing that. We know there's a lot of limits for governments to do that, particularly resource-constrained governments. They need help. They need the latest evidence to be able to address those trade-offs and that kind of thinking. They have to be framed in a new vision, that new vision which is being nurtured by you, by your action tracks, by the food systems dialogues, there has to be a vision into which the trade-offs become part of the dialogue, part of the system. So really our ask of you is, how can we help? As Sandy just said, we've been talking with Joachim about contributing to the science group on evidence and analyses, potential modeling outputs. We're still working in those areas. We've made some presentations that are relevant at a global level in this report. We've talked about and engaged with a lot of players around the so-called IPCC for food idea, and how to approach true cost accounting in ways that make sense in terms of externalities. What are the relevant approaches to engaging on repurposing of subsidies in agriculture R&D, for example, those kinds of things. We deal, however, with a lot of regional and country level policymakers, and there's a lot of potential for assisting you if you so desire. Convening, offering briefings, sharing data. The global panel itself established 2 networks, the African Leaders for Nutrition, ALN, which exists, it's a thing, and Sapling, which is in South Asia, trying to bring together common thinking across regions, in this case, subcontinents and subcontinents, can tap into that. We have a lot of direct policy engagement with policymakers and scientists. We did some scenario building work. We've done briefings and high-level roundtables in many different countries, in Africa and Asia particularly. And I think we can do more. We can certainly do more with private sector engagement. Lawrence has helped with that. We can do more with civil society engagement. But this is a real offer from an ongoing activity for a level of partnership that I hope can make sense for you. And with that, I will stop, and I will ask, if you don't mind, ask Tim if he has any final thoughts to share, particularly relating to the potential for work at the planetary level and link with IPCC, for example.
Thanks, Patrick. I've got 2 or 3 off the top of my head points to make. The first, I think, is that having been working on food systems within the kind of policy sphere for about a decade, I think we have gone from people saying it's an academic concept to it becoming much more mainstream. And for me, the key thing is the recognition that demand and supply are equally important, and both are interlinked, and you can affect supply by changing demand, and you can affect demand by changing supply. And I think that's really key, because certainly when I was an IPCC author, we had a lot of battles inside IPCC around agriculture was the only thing that we were focusing on, and actually it was therefore about changing agriculture rather than changing the market. So I think the food system approach is really important, and therefore, of course, the first World Food System Summit is hugely important about bringing together a lot of threads. And you know, I work, as many of you know, in a variety of areas, working on biodiversity, working on desertification, working on climate change, and working on nutrition. And of course, all of those, we've got major international meetings over the next year, but the Food System Summit brings them all together in one place. And many of the issues that we're talking about within GlobePan Foresight 2 are aimed to each one of those domains, and therefore it's really important that they get the airing within the Food System Summit that they need. Then next point is that, of course, this is hugely timely, the Food System Summit. We've got the urgency due to environmental change. So, you know, literally, if we don't change the way that we relate to food, as Mike Clark's and David Tillman's paper in Science last week showed, we blow out of the water the chances of reaching the Paris Climate Agreement. Unless we start changing things from an agricultural perspective, we lose biodiversity, which makes things worse. We've really got a small window of opportunity to change things. And then we've got COVID on top of that. And COVID, for all of its sins, has changed things quite radically. And we can either build back the way we were and lock ourselves into a decade or two where change is really difficult, or we can drive things to change now. And if we miss this opportunity, I think we miss the window of opportunity for dealing with both biodiversity and with climate change, let alone with the iniquities that come from inequality and unequal access to food. So from my perspective, the Food System Summit is both a one-off opportunity in terms of it's the first, but it's also a one-strike opportunity. If we get it wrong on a global basis, then we've really locked ourselves into a future that doesn't work. And I think just, I'm only on the fringes of what you guys are doing, but I think my big worry is that the action tracks, in a sense, take the food system and carve them up into elements of the food system. And it's how do you collectively make the most of the food system dynamics across the action tracks and within the action tracks. And clearly some of the expertise that we've had associated with doing the foresight report, willing to bend over backwards to help, et cetera, but lots of useful discussions I think we can have. And I'll stop there before I get on my soapbox for too long.
Okay, thanks. So that put on the table the kinds of things that we've been doing in this, I forget now, 250-page report. But of course, it's not about the report. It's about how we facilitate the messaging to the right people and get the right evidence to those people. So, floor is open, and we'd love to hear from you and discuss this further. Sandrine.
Yeah, thank you for that, Patrick. And also, Tim, I think you really hit the nail on the head. And many of us have already been having this conversation, both with the UN Secretariat, but also amongst ourselves. And clearly, because I'm also the vice chair of Action Track 5 on resilience, we've been trying to get our head around how do we create a properly integrated approach between the action tracks, and in particular, think through what resilience truly means. And I want to build on what you've just said, which is I fully agree, and through the work that we're now doing at the Club of Rome, that we have to tap into the consciousness of people as we move out, hopefully, of COVID, as to what is essential. And what does come out as essential continuously is food. And clearly the people, planet, and prosperity, and of course I would love that, because as you know, at the Club of Rome, that is our motto. And our planetary emergency plan very much focuses on that. But I think that unpacking the tensions, which this particular report could do, as we have broader dialogue around it, as to what are the tensions between people, planet, and prosperity, what does that mean within the food system? And how do we then close the circle? Because again, this is in essence what is most important for people. This is what is most essential alongside healthcare, access to water, as we move out of COVID and we recognize that we don't need a lot of things, but we do need to survive. So I do think that making this food summit, the call to action around what actually is essential, how the food system functions within the planetary boundaries as being a much more integrated system that takes into consideration impacts, and of course, regenerative agriculture, all of these elements that lead us then to greater resilience, to future shocks, etc., is really important. So ways in which we can bring in your messaging into the resilience track, create the right food feedback loops in terms of discussion, also with the commissioners, etc., would make a lot of sense.
Okay, great. Good points. Tim.
If I can just quickly respond to that. Sorry, I'd lost my mute button. I think one of the key things is that resilience is a systemic property, obviously, but resilience is also like buying insurance for your home or your car or your holiday or whatever it might be. A resilient system by its nature is more decentralized than centralized, more diverse than uniform focused, has functional redundancy has greater flexibility and more substitutability. Now, all of those things cost. And I think the big challenge for building a resilient system is to recognize that an efficient system by definition is more efficient, removes redundancy, less resilient. So how do we build that kind of recognition that the resilience comes at a cost, but in the long term, just like house insurance or car insurance, we have to find ways of building that cost, protecting the most vulnerable, and actually just changing slightly the mindset that producing ever cheaper, more available food is the answer, because that forgets a vulnerable system.
Yeah.
I'll shut up again, sorry.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, Lawrence.
Thank you, Patrick and Tim. You know, I was involved in this report, but not really much, and so I can't claim any credit really. And it's every time I look at it, and every time it's presented to me, I'm just kind of blown away by how good it is. So I stole lots of slides for this morning's presentation at the Micronutrient Forum opening. So that's yeah, that's testimony that it's good. If I can steal slides from it, it's good.
Yeah.
Now listen, what action tracks are supposed to be action oriented, and they're supposed to be action oriented, and we have to land them at the country level. So I mean, you're quite right. All 5 action tracks are really very determined to make these. We talk about it as we want to make it eventually one action track, but we feel like we have to start in these 5 places with an eye on integration as we go along. For me, I'm trying really to take the kind of analysis you've done at the global regional level down to the country level. So I'd like to be able, so success for my vision of success for the action tracks is getting 6 to 8 to 10 countries who say, yeah, we're gonna have a look at what our ag R&D portfolio is. We're going to have a look at our food-based dietary guidelines. We're going to use that as a guide for our policy. We're going to look at what's possible to repurpose on our subsidies. We're going to think about full cost accounting. And we're going to start thinking about how do we manage the affordability transition. So if you really want to get some countries to even focus on 1 or 2 of those things, you need some of the analysis that the report has done so brilliantly at the global level. You need to bring that down a bit to the country level. So that's where I would really value help, because that, you know, we've got the science group, but I'm not quite sure that the science group has that level of granularity or actually availability of time to do that kind of work. So these are all the things that I'm thinking of. Can the team help with some of that kind of thinking and analysis at the country or even subnational level? Over.
Yeah, yes, and Shao, you certainly come in here.
Thank you very much, Patrick and Tim. Delighted to be here. You know, I was thinking, you know, you rightfully said that action tracks are not silos. They cannot operate in silos, and we're looking for cross-cutting themes. And I think this report brings forward one of the cross-cutting themes. You know, once you activate this report or elements of this report, you activate all action tracks at once. So I think that the power this report has to integrate action tracks, like, you know, if you change food-based dietary guidelines in one place, and if that place begins to that country seriously begins to procure food based on their national dietary guidelines, my gosh, I mean, it will serve a value to my action track, which is to boost nature positive production. So I think, you know, reports like this one can activate all action tracks at once. So I really welcome this conversation. So, but there are other reports which I think were based on the same data from, you know, from the Oxford Martin School. There is the report from GLOPAN. There is one that came from EAT on the G20 with the carbon budgets. There is one for WWF that we did on planet-based diets, which, you know, there is a tool that you activate country by country. There is the science paper that Tim mentioned from Mike Clark from last week, again with the, you know, so there are so many elements that we could bring and unify and seek complementarities. Each of these reports have its own value proposition, but somehow they are integrated. We can bring all of them together to service the action tracks. So wouldn't it be a good idea to take a look at this report, bring the other reports together, and see how they can collectively add value to our action tracks together? So this is just an idea. Thank you.
Sure, Sean. Yeah, and thanks for the compliments. I mean, in some ways we did start that. I mean, I absolutely highlighted key results from many of those other reports, not all of them, certainly. And yes, there are, you know, overlapping interests among those at Oxford, Martin. They're very much in demand. But to your point and Lawrence's, I totally agree that we absolutely, this is intending to be a synthetic framework that draws together the key elements. And you know, we never stop saying actions are needed across the whole food system, and many of them could be done today, right? So, but to Lawrence's point, yes, of course we could potentially look into doing more at country levels. Are you already, I don't know, and this could be a conversation subsequently, but are you already thinking of candidate countries or sub-regions in which this kind of hand-holding, if you want to call it, where we could prioritize so that we're not operating in the dark?
Can I answer that?
Sure.
I mean, every action, what's happening with the action tracks is countries are reaching out to the different action tracks. For practical purposes, and action track leads, tell me if I've got it wrong, but for practical purposes, there's a sense that you don't want any one country to say, I want to engage with all 5, because that favors the more resourced countries, in a sense. So there's an equity issue, and the lower and middle income countries, some of them, the smaller ones, can't engage with all the action tracks, so they have to pick 1 or 2. So each action track has a list of countries that have reached out to it. Then the action tracks are being encouraged to reach out to countries who haven't yet reached out to us. And then we're trying to coordinate the countries across, because you can imagine if every action track decides to work with 12 countries, that's 60 countries.
Right.
That's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Then none of the action tracks are working on the same country. At the other extreme, you've got all the action tracks are working on 12 countries. That's the other extreme, and that's probably not great either. So we're trying to figure out where in the middle are we? Will we end up working on 24 or 25 countries between the action tracks? And these are exemplars on how to integrate the action tracks within their countries. We haven't figured it out yet, but the countries that are reaching out to action track 1 are the ones you would expect, the ones with high levels of hunger, malnutrition, and worried about food safety. You know, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Tanzania, those kinds of places. So India, but I think every action track will have a different set of countries, and we need to somehow figure out how to make sure that, you know, if we're working on Brazil, we want to be working with action track 3 and action track 5, or with action track 2. And, you know, we haven't figured that out yet. Over.
Yeah. No, thanks. Sandy.
Yeah, just to comment on what Lawrence has said. I mean, I think this is a very interesting idea, and we've been thinking in terms of, you know, a future work program which would look at and help guide countries in terms of the evidence and policy development, how they would implement a transition to food system transformation. And we have worked with, as you know, various countries over the years. Some of them we have quite strong relationships with now. And we thought this would be very, very useful, potentially, that if one was able to build those kind of relationships, perhaps with quite a small number of countries, these could be very good kind of, not exactly templates, because that's to make things sound simpler than they are.
Exemplars, yeah.
But they could be very good exemplars. And obviously, but I think we were thinking slightly more longer term, because clearly time is relatively short. It's about, I don't know, a year to the summit. We were thinking of that should be one of the outcomes of the summit, perhaps as well, at least from a global panel perspective. We were thinking that in a future work program, this is the kind of thing that could be very fruitful, whether it was, you know, it could be country-led, there's a regional dimension perhaps, as well as the global, which is obviously where the summit is making a big contribution. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Andy. Any others? Please, Christine, and then Gunhild.
I was just going to add to what Lawrence said of the action track leads working together on specific countries, but we also have the David Nabarro-led food systems dialogue. So seeing how that also integrates the concerns of all 5 action tracks and working closely with him and his team.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Gunhild.
Yeah, and just echoing the congratulations. It's an excellent report, and we have already been using some of your visuals in our work in Action Track 2. And I really like the idea of the small group of countries and help them with the integrations. But I also wonder whether it would be helpful to have you, whether it's like a sounding board or have some inputs when we present the outcomes as one integrated menu of solution propositions. Because the integration and working, as Lawrence said, as one action track will be key, and what we will provide as inputs to the country level dialogues, having the opportunity to run it by you or getting some feedback would be very helpful. And for the first dialogue round in December, what we are planning to present is basically a definition of what do we mean by game-changing or systemic solutions, and also considering trade-offs, etc. And then, I mean, whether there are some straw men and some low-hanging fruits, but do so in an integrated way across the 5. And we are now setting up a meeting which is tentatively scheduled for Monday, the 16th of November, 11 a.m. set, and that is to discuss with people from the science committee how do we define game changing and also consider trade-offs. And it would be super helpful if one of you would like to join that meeting. So that is just an offer to help us shape that.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. We'll figure out a way to contribute and be a sounding board. That's a great idea. Of course, our own ideas are also still developing as we, as everyone contributes new analyses. And I was talking this morning with people from OECD who are putting out a report in January on food systems data gaps. And I think that also is an issue that has to be brought onto the table. The first Foresight report spent a lot of time identifying research needs and data gaps to support policy change. We didn't do so much in this second report, but I think that is an important element that governments are going to point to in terms of, well, on what basis do we make these changes? So yes. Any other points? Comments?
It would be good, Patrick, to hear from Jamie Morrison if he's still with us.
He is, yep.
Yeah. Just to get your impression of, and I think what we've tried to do here, Jamie, is kind of set out a little bit of what the offer is, but also set out the kind of vision within the report and what's in there. Obviously, it's not the only report, and it's very much draws on the work of many people around the world and many organizations. So it would be good to get a sense from you of any other aspects over and above what we've heard this afternoon in terms of how we might package our work, how we might, discussing further maybe the kind of interactions we could do down the line. It would be good to get a sense of your timelines on the action tracks, because like a year's time, 12 months or whatever it is, probably 10 months now, sounds a lot, but I guess you have to have a lot of this material and plans really well integrated long before then, judging by most.
we will be happy to share something very soon. We are working as we speak on defining a timeline with deliverables, etc.
Okay, that
So
would
as soon as we have circulated that across the track leads, then we can share it with you.
Great.
all right.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that point, Sandy, it's not really even 10 to 12 months. I mean, we need to have this coming together by June for the pre-summit event, so that the timeline is tighter than that. And as Gunhild said, I mean, the action track chairs are essentially helping to define what the deliverables will be at different points in that timeline. But I think just reflection on what's been discussed today. I mean, obviously a very positive reaction from all chairs, for, whether it's in terms of helping to think down to the country level, whether it's in terms of thinking through definitions of game changes, what the trade-offs really mean in practice. But I think also it would be helpful as you continue the engagement to think in terms of the contribution to the sort of individual working groups or pillars within the different action tracks. Okay. Each action track is defined, 3, I think, is the model across all of the action tracks, 3 working groups, where the report may be more targeted in terms of what it can bring in existing evidence, but also in terms of solutions. Right. So I think that may be a next step to go down to that. And I see Gunhild. Yeah,
Gunhild. Go ahead.
Thanks for reminding me about that, Jamie. Yeah, indeed, we would love to have a contribution to especially work stream 1 for our track, which is food environment, which is tapping again very nicely into your report. So if you have any capacity to actually engage and be part of a work stream, please let us know.
Yeah. We will find a way to do that. Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Amazing.
I will share my slide deck with I guess Jamie, and you can share with everyone else on the call. Feel free, obviously, to use it however you want. Lawrence is already going to. Yeah. Any final words? We don't want to keep you longer than necessary.
Just one from me, if I may, Patrick, just to say, and we could do this offline, but it would be good, Jamie, to get a sense from you how the emerging vision of the outcomes of the Food Systems Summit are developing within the different action tracks and how coherent that is at that stage. I mean, clearly what is possible is something that's going to become apparent, I guess, and obviously there are all kinds of opportunities and things that can be accelerated during that time. But would you say, and as I say, we can discuss this later if you like, but that the action tracks are coming together with a really evolving, coherent view of the outcomes of the summit? Or is this something that you feel has already been defined fairly well at the outset and you're working to that? Just to try and get a sense of how that, there's so much to play for. And it's still at an early stage, even if you've only got sort of 6+ months.
Can I build on that, Jamie, before you reply?
Yeah, please. That would make my life a lot easier.
Well, I'm not giving an answer. I'm just building.
Well, I was a bit hopeful, I
admit. What I want, I think that's a spot on question. And having just opened the net zero dialogues this morning with the champions around COP26, and also thinking through that narrative, and then having had the nature and people pledge and the narrative with the UN around what we did in September around UNGA. I think that what Sandy is indicating, and also I would love, and I'm sure the other action track leads would love to have a real thinking around what are the key narratives. I mean, beyond the key actions that are going to come out of these working groups and the suggestions and the recommendations that we bring forward, we really do need to think about some joined up narratives that also are linked up to the rest of the UN family and the discussions that are happening around people, planet, prosperity, around systems thinking, around regenerative, circularity, etc. So that we don't start, I mean, terminology and overusing words is a real problem. In particular, we've seen the way some governments are really pushing back on certain aspects and people, we want to bring people on the journey. So the way in which we can work through this together would really be helpful.
Okay, yeah, that's very, very useful. That's all from me, Patrick.
Yep. Well, not going, may actually save you 10 minutes of your life. If there are no other thoughts, then yeah, thank you very, very much for spending some time with us. Very happy, obviously, that the positive reception, and we're here to help as appropriate. So just let us know, and we'll be in touch again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.